So we're going to follow that great discussion from this morning about what's happening in state legislatures and how are they dealing with environment policy and health policy, and how are they finding ways to move legislation forward with somebody who's going to speak to us now with a view from the inside. Bill Pound has been the executive director of the National Conference of State Legislatures since 1987. But he's been with NCSL since its founding in 1975, and he's been instrumental in the development of many of its innovative programs and services designed for legislators, legislative leaders, and legislative staff. Bill has researched and written extensively on legislatures, the legislative process, and fiscal and public finance issues. He speaks to both national and international audiences on topics of state government, fiscal conditions, public policy issues, and the activities of state legislatures and federalism. He also taught political science at the University of Colorado, the University of Denver, and Colorado State University. Please join me in welcoming Bill Pound.
First of all, an apology for my voice today. I have got a summer cold. I'm fighting here. But thank you very much, Teresa, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'm going to speak fairly quickly. I'll try to cover a number of things in federalism and the intergovernmental relationship today, and how the states are reacting in the system. First of all, I want to say over time I want to cover four things. One is state innovation. That'll make it easier, because in my view, states drive domestic policy in this country, and that has been true for a number of years, at least the last 20 or 25 years. Once a number of states do things, and frequently California is the leader in that, the federal government will ultimately pick them up, make national programs out of them. Not always, and sometimes with modifications that the states might not prefer to have. But anyway, that is a fact. Two, the obstacles that are there today to state innovation in that right now, and there are two big ones. One is federal preemption of state authority, which is, I think, likely to be even more of a problem in the foreseeable future than it has been recently. And two, state finances. Then three, the attempts to foster intergovernmental cooperation or cooperation among the levels of government on dealing with many of these problems. And then one that is, I think, a growing issue in the last few years is state preemption of local authority in a number of places or on a number of issues. If asked to describe the state of federalism in this country today, I would say that since November of last year, it is characterized by the word uncertainty. And it remains that way. I thought maybe by August or September of this year, we would have more certainty, but if anything, we probably have less than we did following Election Day and that. This is particularly true of fiscal federalism and the fiscal interrelationship between federal government and state governments. It is, if anything, probably less clear today what direction it is going. If you look at the levels of government, and the National Governors Association around the beginning of this year actually commissioned a survey with a lot of focus groups to talk about government and government services. I would commend it to you, by the way. It is available on NGA's website. You can pull it out. It was done by Frank Luntz, the pollster who specializes in focus groups. But in that, the level of confidence in local government in this country is about 75%. There's a positive view of local government. The level of confidence in state government is about 50%, right around 50% of that. And the level of confidence in the federal government is between 25 and 30% among the American public. Yeah. The greatest challenge I see at the current time is really budgetary, the fiscal policy. Reductions in federal discretionary spending and the budget that President Trump submitted to Congress, whatever may become of it, had a 30% reduction in discretionary spending recommended for the coming year. Is the biggest challenge we've got. One of the others, even if we retain many of these programs and a near level funding, which Congress may do, it's hard to say, is the question of, do we move more toward a block grant system? And if so, is it categorical grants or block grants? And are there going to be requirements for state and local match? I think these are concerns that legislatures and governors all across the country have. One of the other problems we've got, at least over the last couple of years in this relationship, is that state revenues are growing slowly right now. It's about 1.5% to 2% a year. Now, obviously, there are 50 variations to this, just as there are to virtually everything I say. The problem that accompanies that is that spending growth in state government is growing at about 4% a year. And a lot of this is in not discretionary programs in state government. The president's budget, if adopted, would average a 9% reduction in federal discretionary spending in the states. So we would see a drop like that. If you think back to the panel on health care and the effect of some of those costs, it'll be a squeeze that probably California can handle better than most states, but probably nobody can handle it, really, without dramatic relocations in things. We've got a number of issues that we're facing in the federal-state relationship. One of them is infrastructure spending. And this is a good example of the problems we've got right now in the intergovernmental. When the president talked about a massive infrastructure program, which we, of course, have now gone 8 months and don't have it, no action on it. The assumption was there would be a good deal of new spending. If we look at spending for infrastructure in the state today, the states spend 40% of what's spent on infrastructure. The locals spent 35%, and the federal government spends 25%. You tend to think of the federal government as the big daddy in all this, but in fact, they are the junior partner in financing all these things. And in an infrastructure program, it is quite possible, given what's the discussion in Washington, that we would see a requirement for some kind of a state match for federal money in the future, which again drives state spending, whether positively or negatively. In health care, we are now up to where Medicaid constitutes about 29% of state spending. And states spend, of course, by far the smaller amount than the federal government does in this program. This is the only area of state spending that is consistently growing right now, is Medicaid and health care. Education funding actually, as a percentage of state budgets, has declined in recent years. Not a lot, but it certainly is not growing, and higher education particularly has not grown during that period of time. There are not very many positive things I can say about the state-federal relationship. It used to be one of cooperative looking for solutions. Today, I would say it is much more an adversarial situation of the states fighting a defensive battle in Washington to fend off the kinds of things the president's budget would suggest, budget cuts, and requirements on the states that would preempt their authority. The one area where the states have operated very cooperatively is on trying to be able to obtain collection of sales of taxes on internet sales, on interstate transactions and that. There is voluntary compliance, and California is involved in that, in a number of states, but it does not begin to collect the totality of what commerce is in that area. We have been fighting now for 20 years next year to get the Congress to authorize to overcome a U.S. Supreme Court decision that would allow the collection of taxes on internet sales. The current battle has moved to the courts. And in fact, today in South Dakota, a case is being argued before the South Dakota Supreme Court, which clearly contravenes the United States Supreme Court's decisions in this area back in the 90s and in the late 1960s. It's a direct challenge to it. Our assumption is that the South Dakota court will read the U.S. Supreme Court decisions and rule their law unconstitutional. But that's what we want, because we want to go to the Supreme Court again. And the states are pretty much united on this in getting a case before the Supreme Court, because in a number of recent cases, several members of the court have indicated that they realize the world has changed since they made the original decisions and that they are no longer valid. So we'll see what happens with that. It's interesting that that argument is this afternoon in South Dakota. South Dakota passed that bill, and it has been passed in about 5 other states, too. They've done the same thing. In terms of the of health and environmental policy, the states have been innovators in both areas. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, an awful lot of that was, as referenced earlier, was taken from, one, the original act that Massachusetts passed, and from a lot of other things the states have done. There is right today a tremendous amount of innovation going on in that area in the states. Innovation, experimentation, what works, what doesn't work, what have you. The same is true of environment. For example, while the federal government is holding back on renewables and things like that, 29 states have adopted a renewable portfolio, many of them much stronger than anything the federal government or the Congress has talked about. So we see a lot of activity in that area, and I believe we will continue to. And I should note that while partisanship has really grown in the states as it has at the federal level, it isn't, in most cases, quite as strong there yet. And there is still an ability to work across the states on many of these issues. That's what my organization does. We bring people together, and we try to foster that, to foster people getting involved in those things. We do a tremendous amount of training for legislators where we find that it's really useful to bring people with an affinity together. That is, the people who are working in criminal justice. And that's a good example of things, because criminal justice recently, the new administration has backed off on relaxing sentencing and on the lock them up sort of atmosphere. But there was no sign at all this year that the states were following that. In fact, the states have continued to move in the other direction. And I think we will continue to see that in that area. I think we will continue to see it in the environmental area, as your panelists here earlier this afternoon, or this morning pointed out, in what has gone on here in California, with attention to one of the important things, that we are 50 states, that there are differences. I thought the gentleman who said, well, part of California is like Montana and part of it's like Idaho. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, and we have to deal with that all the time. But when you get legislators together, they find out that the California legislature does not all wear horns, as some of them think that, because of its progressive reputation, and that they have an awful lot in common on these things, and they can find solutions that work. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dean Knott, who's going to introduce your next speaker here.